Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for today's webinar is Energy Storage 101 Part 2, Best Practices in State Policy. This webinar is being presented by the Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership, also known as STAP. STAP is supported by the U.S. Department of Energy, Sandia National Laboratories, and the Clean Energy States Alliance. And we have with us our host and presenter for today's webinar, Todd Olinsky-Paul. Todd is a project director here at CESA. Before I pass it over to Todd, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. All of our attendees are in listen-only mode. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of the webinar. You can connect using your computer, mic, and speakers, or you can call in using a telephone. If you'd like to minimize the webinar console control panel there, you can use the orange arrow that you see circled in the picture, or you can also use that arrow to expand the webinar console if you'd like to use it for things like submitting questions. So we do encourage you to submit questions and comments throughout the webinar. You can do that by typing them into the questions box on the webinar console and hitting send. We will be answering as many questions as we can throughout the at the end of the webinar. We're going to save about 15-20 minutes for a Q&A. So we encourage you to submit your questions throughout the webinar. Type them in. We'll get to as many as we can. We do expect to have a lot of questions, so type it in when you think of it. Don't wait until the very end. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you a copy of the webinar recording within about 24 to 48 hours, probably this afternoon. And we'll also be posting a copy of the recording and a PDF of the slides on our website at cesa.org/webinars. And that's a good URL to know about because it's also where we post information about upcoming webinars. So with that, I'd like to pass it over to our host for today's webinar, Todd Olinsky-Paul. As I said, Todd is a project director here at the Clean Energy States Alliance.
Thanks very much, Samantha, and welcome everyone to the webinar. This is Todd Olinsky-Paul. I am a project director here for Clean Energy States Alliance and manage the STAP program, as Samantha mentioned. Clean Energy States Alliance is, in case you are new to our webinar series, essentially a nonprofit membership organization of state clean energy funds. We work with states all over the country, and you can see a number of their logos on the screen. Samantha, I seem to have come in a bit in the middle. Oh, okay, I got it. Never mind. So STEP, as I said, is a project of CESA that we conduct under contract with Sandia National Laboratories. It's funded by DOE Office of Electricity. And again, through STAP, we work with state clean energy agencies and funds all over the country to support energy storage deployment and also to support state energy storage policy efforts. And that's what we're going to be addressing today. It's a topic that's of growing interest to a lot of states. And we have actually an upcoming report. So much of the information that I'm going to present today is kind of a preview of what will be in that report, which we hope to publish this fall. And Samantha, okay, good. I apologize to the audience. We have a slight delay on the slides. So energy storage policy landscape and state policy tools. The reason I included this map is because it shows the degree of interest, I think, in energy storage at the state level. This is from a report called the 50 States of Grid Modernization. It's a quarterly report. It's available online. And basically, as you look at this, all the states that are not gray, so anything that's blue, orange, green, or other colors, is doing or has done something in the realm of energy storage policy. Now, in some cases, that's a study, a road mapping exercise. In some cases, it's regulatory reform. In some cases, it's a grant program or rebate program, a utility procurement target, or in the case of the states colored with green, 3 or more types of actions. So those are really the states, the green ones on this map, that are kind of identifying here as the leaders. Now, that's not to say that they have everything right, and we'll try to, as we go through, I'll try to point out where there are, there's room for improvement on some of these programs, what the pros and cons of them are. Before I do that, I want to talk for a moment about the federal landscape just as a background. The federal landscape essentially is three areas here. There's an investment tax credit, which applies to energy storage when paired with eligible renewables. There are orders from FERC, which is the federal agency that regulates the electrical system in this country. They essentially regulate wholesale markets. So those orders have been very important in areas of the country that are where the electrical system is operated by an independent system operator or a regional transmission organization. And then there are direct supports to states in the form of policy and regulatory support from DOE and the national labs. I'll very briefly go through these. The Federal Investment Tax Credit, or ITC, as I said, can be applied to both solar and storage as long as the storage is renewably charged at least 75%, and below that there is no tax credit. Above that, you get more of a credit the more you're charging from renewables. The ITC has been worth 30% up until this year, through this year. 30% of the installed cost plus accelerated depreciation. So it is an enormous benefit if you can qualify for it. Unfortunately, it is going to begin declining in 2020. So it goes from 30% to 26%, then 22% in 2021, and then by 2022, we are going to be left with a 10% credit for commercial systems. There will no longer be a credit for residential systems, and this is unless there is an act of Congress to extend this program or change it. Now, I mentioned FERC orders. There have been a number of relevant FERC orders in the past few years. The little map you see there shows the colored areas are the ISOs and RTOs around the country. Those are the areas where these FERC orders have impact. A couple to note: FERC Order 755 required pay for performance in frequency regulation markets. That was the order that was used to great effect in PJM, which is shown in orange on the map there. PJM covers much of the mid-Atlantic and northeastern part of the country. There was a very active frequency regulation market in PJM after the passage of FERC Order 755, with something like 300 megawatts of storage now having been deployed in that market, principally for frequency regulation. Now, those rules have changed and it's no longer a hot market, but it shows the power of these FERC market regulations. The most recent one is Order 841, which requires wholesale power markets to allow storage to participate and to take into account the operational characteristics of storage. That's now being rolled out across the country in the various ISOs and RTOs. Getting down to direct regulatory and policy support, some examples of this. I just attended last week and presented at a Southeastern Energy Storage Symposium for electrical system regulators. We've had similar conferences in the Pacific Northwest and the Southwest. These were hosted and organized by Sandia National Laboratory and PNNL. We've also done a lot of work with direct policy support to states. Just a few examples here: Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont. These are supports for essentially technical support for such activities as writing state energy storage road mapping or studies, designing programs like the Massachusetts ACES Energy Storage Grant Program, helping states to evaluate projects submitted for grant programs, and all this kind of activity. Now, having said that, we're really focusing in this webinar on state level policy tools. So that's all I'm going to say about the federal activity. And state policy around energy storage really kind of breaks down into I think, three broad categories. First is studies and planning, and almost every state that's done anything on storage has started with some kind of study or road mapping exercise to kind of figure out what the opportunities and barriers are in that state. Often the states then move on to a grant program. Typically, this is a one-off program designed to give out some money to support demonstration projects so that everyone can kind of see and feel what storage looks like and what it can actually do. And then you have longer term policy and programs, and this really starts to move into the area of market development, longer term support to help develop lasting storage markets and a storage ecosystem in the state. And so there's a lot that falls in this category. So you have utility mandates and procurement targets of various kinds, rebates, storage adders in solar incentive programs, storage incentives in energy efficiency programs, state tax incentives, financing, including low or zero interest loans and clean energy financial institutions like green banks. You have market and regulatory reforms, various dockets in states dealing with things like storage and net metering programs, for example. You have efforts to remove barriers and lower soft costs, and this is in the realm of things like interconnection, siting, permitting, and so forth. And then there are technical assistance tools and resources that states sometimes provide, and this would be, for example, providing technical support to help municipalities develop energy storage projects, best practices guidelines for developers, vetted lists of approved equipment, and so forth. So this is the list we're going to be going through. I'll try to. There's a few of these tools that deserve more attention, and so I have 2 or 3 slides, and then others that I'm hitting with a single slide. So I'll do my best to leave plenty of time for questions. The first one I'm going to talk about is utility mandates and procurement targets, and I want to mention that those aren't exactly the same. So there are a number of states that have utility procurement targets, but they're not enforced. So they're saying, well, we want the utilities in our state to procure X amount of storage by such and such date, but there's no enforcement mechanism. And then there are mandates where the state is essentially creating a procurement standard similar to an RPS for storage, where the state says you utilities shall procure X amount of storage by this date, and if you don't, there will be alternative compliance fees, and we'll take that money and we'll do something with it, like subsidizing smaller scale distributed storage or something like that. So as an example, I'm looking here at the California procurement mandate. It was established in 2013. So it was the first one, and therefore has the most history to look at. A couple of things to note. One is that in California, they broke this mandate down by the specific utilities. So Southern California Edison, Pacific Gas and Electric, and San Diego Gas and Electric each has their own target. Then within those utility targets, that's further broken down into 3 buckets: transmission, distribution, and customer-sited storage. So, for example, Southern California Edison is supposed to be acquiring 310 megawatts of storage on the transmission system, 185 megawatts on the distribution system, and 85 megawatts behind customer meters. This structure guarantees that you're going to get a variety of storage located in various places on the grid, some close to load behind the customer meter, some on the transmission, the bulk power system, and some in the middle in the distribution system. So this guards against having it all kind of taken up by a single big procurement. For example, a utility decides they want it all on the transmission system, and then there's nothing kind of left in the procurement for anybody else. Another thing to note is that this overall target of 1,325 megawatts or 1.3 gigawatts was expanded. The state added another 500 megawatts, so the total is now 1.8 gigawatts. And a couple other things, utilities can own up to 50% of this capacity. So that, again, guarantees that at least half of this 1.8 gigawatts of storage is going to be owned by customers or third parties. And so that, that tends to encourage diversity and competitiveness in the storage market and avoids any kind of monopoly situation. I also want to mention that the California Public Utility Commission prioritizes public sector and low-income customers. So there is some effort to make sure that that this new technology, energy storage, is shared with communities who really need it the most, those who are the low-income, underserved communities. So if you look at the list on the left, California, as I said, was the first to do this, but a number of other states have adopted similar targets: Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, and Oregon. One other thing to note is that most of these states adopted a megawatt target. A couple of them adopted a megawatt hour target. They are different. Megawatt hours obviously adds a time element to it. And what that means is that, well, if you don't have the hours on there, if you say, go out and procure 1,000 megawatts of storage, it could be 1,000 megawatts of storage in a capacitor bank, and it all gets discharged in 15 seconds or something. That would still count as 1,000 megawatts. If you don't have a time element in the unit, so adding the hours on there ensures that we're talking about storage that discharges over an hour. So it's if it's Oregon, it's 5 megawatts over an hour. So just wanted to mention that distinction. So looking at, again, California, just to note the progress. Now it's been 5 years. And in that 5 years, if you look at the bottom right figure there, you see that the California utilities in 5 years have actually surpassed the original target of 1.3 gigawatts. They now have over 1.4. Now, not all of this is actually online. Some is in progress of being developed and others are pending approval, but it's moved quite quickly. The other thing I want to mention is that the behind the meter storage is able to be developed just as fast or faster as the storage on the transmission and distribution system. So if you look at Southern California Edison, total procured on the right, you'll see that the vast majority of theirs is actually customer sited. They have over 300 megawatts there on the customer column, and as compared to say Pacific Gas and Electric, where most of theirs is on the transmission system. So it really does depend on how the utility wants to procure and what the guidelines are set by the state when they set up the program. I want to go on now to talk about rebates. Rebates are kind of along with procurement standards, these are two very standard, well understood ways that states get clean energy into the generation mix. We've been doing procurement standards for a very long time. Likewise, we've been doing rebates for a long time. We have solar rebates, wind rebates, it's biomass rebates, et cetera. So right now we have two main rebate programs, California and New York. I'm going to talk about California again because, again, their self-generation incentive program, or SCHIP, is the longest running. It was actually developed in the early 2000s. It was modified in 2016. Originally, it was a solar program, and then it was modified in 2016 to focus almost 80% of the program budget on energy storage. So there's been a few years now to look at progress in this program. It was recently refunded in 2018 for $830 million through 2025. So it's an extremely well-funded program. The design is it's an upfront rebate. It has a declining block structure. So what that means is that you would have you would take a portion of the budget and say, okay, for the first $50 million in the budget, the rebate rate is going to be, say, 50 cents a kilowatt. After that's fully subscribed, then you would drop down to the next block and say, okay, the next, say, $30 million worth of rebates are going to be at a 40 cents a kilowatt rate, and so forth and so on. So that, because it's declining, it tends to encourage early adoption. It tends to kind of compensate for the effect of declining storage prices. So instead of waiting around and saying, well, maybe the price will go down if I wait a couple of years, this sort of compensates for that and encourages consumers to go ahead and invest in storage while the rebate is at a high rate. Want to note also here there's a 25% equity carve out for low-income customers in this rebate. This is defined geographically, but also applies to anyone who lives in affordable housing, and 15% of the budget is reserved for residential customers. So again, there are some carve outs that are intended to ensure that this is not all just going to wealthy companies and wealthy early adopters. Since its refocus on storage in 2016, the program has disbursed $158 million in incentive payments and supported 828 behind-the-meter battery projects. These statistics are a little old, so it's probably up around 1,000 by now, both residential and commercial, representing almost 67 megawatts of capacity. That's defined as an average discharge of power across 2 hours. And there's another 31 million reserved or pending. So that's the program. Now, I said that it was intended to do a lot of good things, and it has done a lot of good things. There are a few issues here that I'll get to in a minute. So the advantages of this kind of program, I'm not going to go through all of these, but the basic idea here is that it helps to build a market. It defrays upfront costs, which are typically a primary barrier for people to buy storage. It provides a reliable, long-term, and financeable market structure for developers. So this is the kind of program that can be marketed to customers by developers. Typically solar and storage installers will go out and market this to their customers. It gives the state a lot of control. You have complete control over rates and budget. It can, unlike something like a tax incentive where you're not really sure, sometimes what that's going to look like at the end. You can completely control and adjust. You can lower and raise the rates as needed. You can provide extra support for low-income customers in the form of adders, or in this case, carve-outs, or low-cost financing. And it's easy to track statistics. If you go to the SCHIP website, they have an amazing website where you can get just about any statistic about this program that you want. Please don't ask me what the statistics are, but I would just recommend that you go to that page if you're interested. And this has proven to work well in tandem with procurement mandates, which I just discussed. So California, through the combination of the SCHIP rebate along with the utility procurement mandate, has seen really nation-leading growth in storage deployment. Now, I mentioned that there are some disadvantages as well. One is that the equity carve-out in this program has not been effective. There have not been very many low-income participants, and they've tried to amend the program by adding some small rate adders for low-income participants, but probably not sufficient to address the problem. The rebate model is a great one from many perspectives, but one thing it doesn't do is provide a price signal or any way to control when those batteries are charged and discharged. So you're giving people a rebate, they're installing the battery, and then they operate it however they're going to operate it. And so there's been some evaluation reporting on the SGIP program that basically said, yeah, it's working great to get batteries out there, but that doesn't mean you're necessarily meeting the state's goals. For example, the batteries being supported under SGIP have not thus far reduced emissions. And the reason is that there is no price signal that would lead people to discharge their batteries in a way that would reduce emissions. If you set up such a price signal, if you said, okay, we think emissions are greatest at peak hours between 2 and 5 p.m. So if you discharge your battery at that time, we'll give you an extra bonus credit or something, then you would probably see that happen. So basically the state needs to consider ways in which the state goals, whatever they are, whether it's peak demand reduction or emissions reduction or renewables integration or whatever, can be met. And it may require a combination of something like a rebate along with something like some kind of price signal, performance payment or otherwise. Okay, I want to not spend more time on SGIP. I want to move on to the concept of storage in existing incentive programs, such as a solar program. Several states have done this. Massachusetts, notably with its smart solar program, is a good example. It replaced a previous SREC program. It's another declining block type of program. And what it basically does is it provides a rebate for solar, and then there's a bunch of adders. And one of the adders is for energy storage, and these adders are stackable. So there's a list here on the screen. If you were to install solar with a battery in your facility, and it was mounted on the building, and it happened to be a low-income property, and you had a battery, then you could stack 3 adders, one for building-mounted solar, one for low-income property solar, and one for energy storage. So that's a good incentive, a good way to create incentives for people to do the kinds of projects that you're looking to get. Now, in order to be eligible for this adder, storage has to meet certain program requirements, obviously. Power rating has to be at least 25% of the capacity of the associated solar. Has to be at least 2 hours duration storage. It has to have a certain round trip efficiency, and it has to data report and so forth and so on. One thing is they require at least 52 complete cycles of the storage per year. So you have to discharge the battery essentially weekly, just to show that you are using it and it's not just sitting there gathering dust. And as a basic requirement, the storage is supposed to either reduce on-site peak demand or increase self-consumption of on-site generated solar energy. So the incentives are calculated using this extremely complicated formula. The short version of this is that the incentives for the solar range from 28 cents to 34 cents a kilowatt hour, and the storage adder adds another anywhere from 4.5 to 7.5 cents per kilowatt hour based on the size. And as with the other programs, there's lots of information online about this. For a rough idea of the value of the adder, they've provided this handy matrix. And there's also a visualization here. So you can see that the value of the energy storage adder increases until you get to about 50% of the solar capacity, and then it kind of flattens out. So there's a sweet spot, and the developers are well aware of that, and that's how they're sizing systems, which is fine unless you want to use it, for example, for resiliency, in which case you may want to size it larger. Or for demand charge management, in which case you might also want to size it larger. And so this adder isn't really aligned with all the various applications for the storage. It's merely aligned with the relative size of the storage capacity. Okay, moving along, storage and energy efficiency programs. We did a lot of work on this over the past couple of years in Massachusetts. Starting in January of this year, energy storage was included in the Massachusetts Energy Efficiency Program as a peak reduction measure. And this is the first in the nation, but it has been picked up by a number of other New England states, and the utilities involved are now marketing this or proposing this in Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and Connecticut. It's being considered in Vermont. It's being considered in some other states as well. In order to get this done in Massachusetts, there were two requirements as a regulatory matter. First, the concept of efficiency, or more specifically, the regulating law, the law that defines the energy efficiency program, had to be expanded to include peak demand reduction as a goal of the efficiency program. Secondly, storage had to be shown to be cost effective in order to pass the cost effectiveness test that all efficiency measures have to pass to be included in the program. I'll go through these one at a time quickly. Redefining efficiency is a conceptual shift. Traditional efficiency reduces overall net consumption of electricity, and it's very good at that. But traditional efficiency doesn't shift where the peaks occur. In other words, if you look at the demand curve for any house or commercial facility, it will have times of low use and times of high use of electricity during every day. And the highest points in that curve are the peaks. And then if you look regionally, the entire region also has peak demand times. And those peaks are extremely expensive, and so therefore they're valuable to get rid of. Peak demand reduction doesn't reduce the overall consumption of electricity the way traditional efficiency measures do. But peak demand reduction, and storage is a prime technology to accomplish this, is able to shift the peaks and flatten the load curve. The reason that is valuable is shown in this chart. This is from the Massachusetts State of Charge report. It shows that over the course of a year, 40% of the total annual cost of electricity for the state was accounted for by the top 10% of the hours, top 10% demand hours, which typically happen during the summer when everyone's using air conditioning. So the highest value of storage is in reducing those top 10% of the hours. Doesn't mean you have to run storage all the time. It means you have to run it specifically when the region is experiencing demand peaks. And if you can do that, you can save the whole system a lot of money. The other way to look at this is that the white spaces in this chart are the inefficiency in the system. You have a system, electrical system, designed to meet occasional peaks. When the system is not experiencing those peaks, it's oversized, and so that's inefficiency. You have equipment sitting idle, depreciating, and so being able to flatten the load curve and reduce those peaks can save quite a lot of money. So I talked about redefining efficiency. This was done legislatively. I won't belabor this. There are a number of acts that were passed by the state legislature to redefine efficiency, to include peak demand reduction, and to include storage as an eligible measure. Then it remained to show that storage was cost effective, and Clean Energy Group, in order to help with this, contracted with applied economics clinic to do a white paper on the cost benefit of energy storage behind the meter. And the result was that the cost benefit ratio was 2.8 for low-income customers and 3.4 for commercial industrial customers, meaning that for every dollar you invest in energy storage behind the meter, you're getting somewhere between 2.8 and $3.4 of benefits in return. This shows that it passes the required cost-benefit test. Utilities in the state then did their own tests, came up with very similar numbers. I won't go through this whole chart, but essentially it was deemed to pass the required cost effectiveness test, and therefore it was included in the energy efficiency program. The results are that we expect there to be something in the area of $13 million worth of incentive payments over 3 years, and we expect that to incentivize around 34 megawatts of behind the meter storage over those 3 years in Massachusetts. It had some shortcomings. Notably, there was no enhanced incentive or carve out for low-income customers, no upfront rebate, which would have helped, I think. And those benefit cost ratios were probably too low due to emissions in the calculations. However, it is a first in the nation program. It could certainly be improved, but it's quite a big step. And there's a lot of interest, as I said, in other states in replicating this program. The rates that are offered by the utilities are pretty good. This is an example from National Grid. For Massachusetts, they are offering $200 per kilowatt in the summer and $25 per kilowatt in the winter for commercial customers, a little bit more for residential customers. And this is a rate, the structure of these performance payments is a little odd, so I'll go through and explain it. But essentially, this rate is multiplied by the average load reduction during peak events that are signaled by the utility and that the customer then responds to using their battery. So to go through an example here, commercial customer installs a 60 kilowatt hour battery, signs up for this summer daily dispatch program at $200 per kilowatt. There's a 3-hour dispatch call. So that 60 kilowatt hour battery is on average, at best, going to result in a 20 kilowatt load reduction over 3 hours. That 20 kilowatt average load reduction is multiplied by the $200 incentive rate, and that results in a $4,000 maximum payout at the end of the season to the customer. And that is a payment for performance. The customer is using their battery to respond to a signal from the utility and helping that utility save money for the entire rate base by lowering peaks during high demand times. This is all explained in a report that we published in April. It's available for free on our website. The underlying economics are also included, the cost benefit of storage, and also 7 non-energy benefits of storage that we've gotten some values attached to by the economist. If you're interested in this, feel free to download this and then get in touch with me if you have questions. I will try to get through the remainder of my presentation quickly so we have time for questions now. But briefly, a comparison between the two Massachusetts programs, Smart Solar with a storage adder versus the energy efficiency plan. The SMART incentive requires storage to be paired with solar. Energy efficiency doesn't matter. It can be standalone or paired with renewables. It doesn't make a difference. Both of them are for new systems only. The SMART incentive is a deployment incentive, though there are a few operational requirements. As long as you meet those requirements, you get paid for deploying the battery. And the incentive is based on the size and duration of that system relative to the solar that it's attached to. For the efficiency program, it's a performance incentive. There's a 5-year contract. The incentive is actually a performance payment based on average load reduction during those dispatch calls. So there are very different type of program. They have different elements, and we expect them to both be used, because there's no reason that you can't qualify for the SMART incentive and sign up for the energy efficiency performance payment and net meter, and do other things like demand charge management if you're a commercial customer. So this is a very attractive suite of policies in Massachusetts, and it'll be interesting to see how much storage is deployed behind the meter. All right, a few last things here. Tax incentives. I want to mention Maryland is the only state I know of that's offered a state income tax credit for storage systems. This may become something that states want to consider, given that the federal tax credit is fading out quickly. This has been not a very impactful program, at least in the first year. Only 61 residential customers and 1 commercial customer in Maryland claimed this energy storage income tax credit. So one might conclude that you need some other economic drivers in order to really move the market. Nevertheless, tax credit would be a nice thing to have in other states. Lowering soft costs. This encompasses a whole range of initiatives and programs, financing through green banks and low or no interest loans and PACE programs, market and regulatory reforms, including we've seen net metering dockets in California and Massachusetts, capacity dockets, third-party aggregation rules, utilities deploying storage behind customer meters and using aggregated customer storage as a virtual peaker plant. There's all kinds of ways that this can be done. It can be done by third-party installers as well, and that's going to be increasing, I think, as developers begin to aggregate those systems and sell them into markets. There are ways to remove barriers to deployment. This is very important. Interconnection rules really need to be addressed. Siting and permitting reforms, safety, fire safety guidelines, et cetera, really need to be addressed. Technical assistance, tools and resources. It's really good to have public technical assistance available, best practices guides, state vetted equipment and installer lists, and so forth. This is all, these things have all been, we've got experience in these types of measures from our experience with solar, so it shouldn't be difficult for most of this to apply and adapt it to storage. I also want to mention briefly, there are larger systems reforms and market reforms in many states. Again, this is from the 50 states of grid modernization. Most of the states in the country at this point are in some way addressing grid modernization, resiliency, and or clean peak. Not going to dwell on that, but all of those potentially can provide markets for energy storage. I also want to mention Colorado has a couple of interesting programs that I don't see in other states. One is there is a storage as a right bill that was adopted. Consumers have the right to install storage systems, and utilities are required to provide a streamlined interconnection process because it is a customer right. Also, only 1 revenue meter is needed. That's in contrast to some other states. Massachusetts, if you're in the SMART program and you want a net meter, you have to have 3 meters. So that's can be a barrier. Also, Colorado requires utilities to include energy storage in their planning processes. This is very important. If the utilities doing an integrated resource planning process, and they are not required to look at storage for any number of applications, including T&D deferral, including distribution system, upgrades and so forth and so on. If that isn't included in the analysis, then it's not going to get deployed. So, at least by the utility. So, it's important to make sure that energy storage is included when these IRPs are conducted. That law also stipulates, very importantly, that storage may be owned by either a utility or any other person. So again, guarding against any kind of monopoly situation that could potentially arise. Also want to mention we here at Clean Energy Group did a national survey with NREL of demand charge rates. This was a couple of years ago. Very interesting. When we talk about demand charge management, I haven't belabored that in this presentation, but it is a good underlying application in many areas of the country for storage to be able to achieve a good payback for its commercial installations. And obviously, you know, if you look at the map, the darker the area, the more customers are paying high demand charges that could justify energy storage for demand charge management alone. This is not including all kinds of other applications and incentives. Obviously, California and areas in the Northeast have high demand charges, but some areas you wouldn't expect, like the Southeast, Southwest, Midwest, Mid-Atlantic. So there really is much more widespread underlying economic basis for storage than many people realize. And so states who have this kind of underlying economic sort of basis for storage may find that with just a little bit of work to put together an incentive program of some kind or a storage target of some kind, that quite a lot of behind the meter storage can be deployed quickly because commercial customers are going to be able to achieve demand charge savings. So conclusions, markets for storage are still underdeveloped. And so many valuable services that storage can provide are not monetizable, meaning that the owner of the storage can't collect money, even though that storage resource can provide valuable services. State policies and programs can help bridge gaps and jumpstart markets until these applications become monetizable and markets mature. Incorporating storage into existing programs with dedicated funding can be a fast and effective way to provide support. So whereas it may be difficult for a state to find new money and stand up an entirely new storage rebate, for example, it might be easier to include it in the solar program, or include it in the energy efficiency program, or include it in the existing utility procurement mandate. Technical assistance is still important to ensure that projects are successful, and especially to ensure safety. Issues of customer ownership and low income access need to be addressed. I've mentioned this quite a few times in this presentation. And there's no silver bullet. So a variety of policy approaches is recommended, including incentives for customers, procurement standards for utilities, financing support, regulatory reform, and soft cost reductions. I think we've seen that states like Massachusetts and California that combine several different types of storage policies are the ones that are getting results. So thank you very much. And thank you again to U.S. Department of Energy and Sandia National Laboratories for supporting our energy storage work through the STAP program. And I will now take questions if we have some.
We do have some questions. Thanks, Todd. So let me pull some of them up. So here's a good question to start. This person wants to know, a couple people wrote in asking about new programs versus retrofit programs. And if you know of state programs, it seems like they're giving a preference to supporting new programs. Can you speak to that?
New programs.
Versus a retrofit.
You mean new, I think they mean
new projects, I'm sorry.
New projects, yes, okay. So yeah, yeah, it depends on the definition. And I think that, I mean, obviously, if you're going to provide some kind of incentive, you want people to install new equipment. You don't want them to simply say, well, I've got this battery that's been sitting in my garage for 10 years. Can you give me a rebate on it retroactively? But I think the real question is whether to incentivize retrofits. So for example, if you have an existing solar system, can you retrofit with storage and get an incentive? The answer to that is just going to be on a state-by-state, program-by-program basis. I think that if you include storage as an adder in an existing solar program, or a program that's primarily devoted towards solar, like the SMART program in Massachusetts, then naturally you're kind of prioritizing the solar. The storage is an adder, but it's not the primary focus of the program. And so in order for it to fit into the program, I think it has to kind of fit into the overall program rules, and their goal is to get additional new solar deployed. On the other hand, there's no reason you can't have just a straightforward rebate for energy storage. As far as retrofits in other contexts, I think that the ITC, I'm actually not sure. There's been some argument back and forth about whether retrofit storage with existing solar is qualified for the ITC. I believe it is, and I think there's some letter rulings on it, but I don't think it's necessarily considered to be settled. And given the ITC is going away, it's maybe a moot point. But yeah, I don't think that we should discourage retrofits by any means.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question. Someone wants to know if you see any drivers for long duration storage, like 4+ hours on the state level.
Well, there are certainly drivers in the sense that some programs derate storage. So for example, the Massachusetts Energy Efficiency Program, as I described it, has a 3-hour dispatch signal. And so you're going to get paid based on an average across that 3 hours. Since you don't have time to discharge, recharge, and discharge again within 3 hours typically, that means that your nameplate capacity gets essentially derated. So if you have a 60 kilowatt hour system, your average on 3-hour discharge is going to be 20 at most. So in that sense, it is encouraging longer systems to have a larger capacity and greater length of discharge in a sense. I think that you'll start to see this as the peak demand management progresses. So early on, which is where we are in this process right now, we're just starting to address peak demand in a few states, and that has to increase. And so you're going to see that there's a lot of value in 2-hour storage initially, because 2-hour storage will take off the very peakiest part of the peak load. Once you've kind of fully subscribed at that level, then the next thing you need is 4-hour storage to get the next bit of peak down from the very top. So then you need 4-hour, and then you need 6-hour, and so forth and so on. So, and unfortunately, the incremental value of those reductions may decrease. But on the other hand, that's a volumetrically a larger, sort of wider peak. So I don't know how that, pans out in terms of value in the end, but I think that you will start to see requirements for longer duration storage. On the other hand, I don't think we want to go overboard. PJM right now requires 10 hours to play in the capacity market. That seems, on the face of it, a little excessive to me.
Okay, thank you. So this next question, I think it was particularly about the Massachusetts SMART program, but I'm guessing that other state programs do something similar. So this person wants to know why they don't give rebates if the storage is above 100% of the solar PV that it's connected to.
Well, you'd have to ask the people who designed the SMART program, but I suspect it's because it's a solar program. And so they, they're sort of providing an adder on the theory that it enhances the value of the solar. And so if the capacity of the storage exceeds the capacity of the solar, then arguably you're kind of installing more storage than you need to enhance the value of that solar. I'm not sure exactly what their response would be. I suspect it would be something similar to that. But I think, again, because it's at heart, it's a solar program, most of the rebate goes toward the solar installation. And so everything is pegged to the solar capacity in that particular program.
Okay, thank you. This person has written in, and a couple people have written a similar question. It seems that storage has two primary sources of value: more economic grids and the climate benefits. So how do we make sure that government programs target both of these benefits?
That's a great question. So if you wanted to break it down a different way, there are monetizable benefits and non-monetizable benefits. So, for example, after Superstorm Sandy, we saw a lot of interest in storage for resiliency, and a lot of states put money into programs for that purpose. There's no resiliency market, and it doesn't matter how critical a facility you have. If you are running the only gas station within 10 miles, and if you go down, the local first responders can't refuel their trucks and vehicles, you're a critical facility. But there is no market. There's no you can't install a battery for resiliency and then monetize that somehow and say, well, I'm providing a service to the community. But you can install a battery potentially and monetize demand charge reductions using that battery. So we're unfortunately right now in a place where a lot of the value of storage is not monetizable, and we're trying to find ways to allow people to do good things with energy storage and find other ways to pay for it. And that has to change. And so we have to get to the point where we not only recognize the value of reduced emissions, enhanced resiliency, and other, reduced land use and other non-energy benefits of storage, but we also, attach actual dollar values to that, and then do something to make sure that storage can actually get those services to pay somehow. And since those markets aren't there, that's where states need to step in. So I guess the answer to the question is states need to be clear about what they're trying to achieve with a storage incentive program, and then figure out a way to make sure that storage providers get paid for providing that service, whatever that is, whether it's incorporating more renewables, or whether it's reducing the amount of water that's needed to cool fossil fuel power plants, or whatever the case may be.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're running close to out of time, but here's a nice question perhaps to wrap things up. This person writes, what do you think is the most urgent policy change that will enable storage to have more revenue streams and make it more economically viable?
Well, I think I've gone through a number of types of policies that will help with that. Again, I guess I think that you really want to look at what you can do to encourage open, diverse, competitive markets for services that are valuable. I mean, we saw how this worked in PJM. As soon as there was a pay for performance requirement, all of a sudden you had 300 megawatts of storage installed. And the reason is that it's better at providing a needed service than the existing resources were. And that pay for performance was based on it's an obvious idea, but somehow it hadn't been previously incorporated into the market, which was that if you're better at following a signal, if you can follow it faster and more accurately, then you should get paid more. And up until FERC stepped in with Order 755, that just wasn't the case. You had fossil fuel power plants in PJM and getting paid for frequency regulation, and they were just not very good at following the variable load and the signal from the grid operator. Storage is much more accurate. So as soon as you say, okay, we're going to pay more for a better performing device, and you open the market and make sure that there are no barriers to storage to enter that market, it does. And it provides a service and it gets paid. So, I really think that's where this all is trending. We shouldn't have to have rebates and incentives forever. We should have viable, open, competitive markets without barriers to participation.
Great, thank you, Todd. And thank you to everybody who's typed in questions. We did get a ton of questions, and I'm sorry that we just don't have time to answer them all. Todd, do you have any closing thoughts before we end the webinar?
Well, just that, as I said, we have a report that we hope to be publishing in the fall that will serve as a resource, I hope, for state policymakers and regulators on these topics. And so this is kind of a preview of that report. I'd love to hear from participants if there's something that was left off or something some state program that I've missed. I'm sure there are many. And we will get that report out and we'll notify folks when it's out.
Sounds good. Thanks, Todd. And thanks again to everybody for attending today. This webinar has been recorded. We'll be posting it on our website this afternoon. You can find it at cesa.org/webinars. Here is some contact info for us as well as for Todd. And we do encourage you to keep an eye out for that paper that Todd mentioned coming out sometime soon. And we have some upcoming webinars related to energy storage that may be of interest to you. You can find information about those on our website. Again, that's cesa.org/webinars. So we hope to see you at some of these upcoming webinars. And thank you for joining us today. Bye, everyone.